I wanted peace after 20 years as a U.S. Marshal. Then HOA boss Margaret saw my Porsche and got angry. She paid fake cops to steal my car early morning. She made a big mistake. She didn't know I catch criminals for a living. Time to teach her a lesson. Before watching full story, comment below from where you watching, also liker and subscribe for more stories. The morning sun painted golden streaks across my driveway as I stepped out to admire my pride and joy, a pristine black Porsche 911 Turbo. After 20 years of serving as a U.S. Marshal, this car represented every sacrifice, every dangerous mission, and every night away from home. I had earned every inch of its sleek body and every horsepower under its hood. My name is Jake Morrison, and I had just moved into Willowbrook Estates, an upscale neighborhood that promised peace and quiet after decades of chasing fugitives and protecting federal witnesses. The community looked perfect: manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and a sense of security I craved after years of living with constant danger. But I didn't know about Margaret Thornfield. Margaret was the self-appointed queen of the Homeowners Association, a woman whose entire existence revolved around controlling every aspect of our neighborhood. She stood 5 feet tall but carried herself like a general commanding an army. Her silver hair was always pulled back in a tight bun, and her eyes held the cold calculation of someone who had never been told no in her adult life. The first warning came from my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Chin, a sweet elderly lady who had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years. She knocked on my door the day after I moved in, holding a plate of homemade cookies and wearing a worried expression. "Jake," she whispered, glancing around nervously, "I need to warn you about Margaret Thornfield. She's the HOA president and she's not a nice person." Mrs. Chin told me horror stories about families who had been driven out of the neighborhood by Margaret's relentless harassment. A young couple with twins had been fined repeatedly for their children's toys being visible in the yard. An elderly veteran had been forced to remove his American flag because Margaret claimed it was too large and ostentatious. A single mother had received daily violation notices for her car being parked 6 inches into the grass. "She targets anyone who doesn't bow down to her authority," Mrs. Chin explained. "And that beautiful car of yours. I'm afraid it's going to make you a target." I thanked Mrs. Chin for the warning but didn't think much of it. After dealing with armed criminals and fugitives for 2 decades, how bad could a suburban HOA president be? I was about to find out. The first confrontation came exactly 3 days after Mrs. Chin's warning. It was a Tuesday morning and I was loading my gear into the Porsche for another day of court testimony when Margaret marched across the street, her heels clicking against the pavement like gunshots. She moved with the purposeful stride of someone who had never been challenged in her own domain. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Are you the new resident in 1247 Oak Avenue?" I turned, offering a polite smile. "Yes, ma'am. Jake Morrison. Nice to meet you." Her eyes immediately locked onto my Porsche like a hawk spotting prey, and I watched something shift in her expression, a mixture of disdain, jealousy, and barely contained fury. This wasn't just about HOA rules, this was personal. My car represented everything she resented: success she hadn't earned, freedom she couldn't control, and beauty that highlighted the ugliness in her own soul. "Mr. Morrison," she began, pulling out a clipboard that seemed permanently welded to her arm, "I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Willowbrook Estates HOA. We need to discuss your completely unacceptable vehicle situation immediately." The word unacceptable dripped from her mouth like poison. I could feel the hostility radiating from her like heat from a furnace. My vehicle situation? I raised an eyebrow, genuinely confused but already sensing this conversation was heading nowhere good. "This gaudy, ostentatious display," she gestured dismissively at my car as if it were a pile of garbage. "It's completely inappropriate for our community standards. The HOA covenant clearly states that all vehicles must maintain a family-friendly appearance and cannot exceed certain value thresholds that might create economic disparities among neighbors." I stared at her for a moment, wondering if this woman had completely lost touch with reality. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I bought this house and paid all the required fees. I wasn't aware there were restrictions on what kind of legal vehicle I could park in my own driveway." Margaret's face flushed an angry red, and I could see a vein throbbing in her temple. "Mr. Morrison, I don't think you understand how things work here. This is a respectable neighborhood, not some flashy display ground for people trying to show off their wealth like common criminals. Your car is disturbing the peace and harmony we've worked so hard to maintain." "Disturbing the peace?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Ma'am, it's a parked car. It's not making noise, it's not leaking fluids, and it's completely legal." Margaret's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. Legal doesn't mean appropriate, Mr. Morrison. This isn't some urban wasteland where people flaunt their possessions without consideration for others. I'm giving you exactly 48 hours to remove this offensive vehicle from the premises, or the HOA will be forced to take immediate and decisive action. The threat hung in the air between us like smoke from a gun barrel. I could see neighbors peeking through their curtains, watching this confrontation unfold. Some looked sympathetic, others appeared frightened, as if they'd witnessed Margaret's wrath before and knew what was coming next. And what kind of action would that be? I asked calmly, my law enforcement training keeping my voice steady despite my growing irritation. Margaret smiled, a cold, calculating expression that didn't reach her eyes. Let's just say I have resources at my disposal that most residents aren't aware of. People who can handle difficult situations when homeowners refuse to comply with community standards. As she clicked away on her heels, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield, I stood there feeling a familiar sensation I hadn't experienced since my early days chasing violent criminals, the distinct feeling that I was being threatened by someone who might actually be dangerous. Mrs. Chin appeared at her front door the moment Margaret disappeared into her house. "Oh, Jake," she called softly, "I saw what happened. Please be careful. She's not just mean, she's vindictive. And she has friends who help her get revenge on people who don't do what she wants." That night, I did something I hadn't done since moving to the suburbs. I activated the security system on my property and positioned myself where I could watch my Porsche through the bedroom window. Something about Margaret's final threat had triggered every instinct I'd developed over 20 years of federal law enforcement. At 3 a.m. I saw movement in the shadows near my car. Two figures dressed in dark clothing were examining my Porsche with flashlights, taking pictures and what appeared to be measurements. They moved with the clumsy confidence of amateurs who thought they were being sneaky but had no real training in surveillance or stealth. I could have confronted them immediately, but my experience had taught me that patience often revealed more than quick action. I watched and recorded as they spent nearly an hour documenting every detail of my vehicle, then disappeared into the night. The next morning brought Margaret's promised retaliation, but it came in a form that shocked even me. The loud, aggressive banging on my door came at exactly 6 a.m. Still half asleep but instantly alert from years of training, I grabbed my service weapon and approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, I could see two men in what looked like police uniforms, but something felt immediately wrong about the entire situation. "Open up, police. Official HOA business," one of them shouted, his voice carrying the false authority of someone trying too hard to sound legitimate. My training kicked in immediately. Real cops didn't usually show up unannounced at dawn unless there was an emergency, and they certainly didn't mention HOA business in the same breath as police authority. I threw on clothes and opened the door, keeping the chain lock engaged and my hand near my weapon. "Can I help you, officers?" I asked through the crack in the door. The taller one, a heavy-set man with a badge that looked like it came from a costume shop, stepped forward aggressively. "Sir, we're here about reports of a stolen vehicle in your driveway. We need to inspect your Porsche immediately and see all registration documents." Every alarm bell in my head started ringing at once. Their badges were completely wrong, their uniforms didn't match any local department I knew, and their patrol car, if you could call it that, was an ancient Crown Victoria with magnetic police decals so poorly applied that they were already peeling off the doors. "Officers, what department are you with exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and professional. "Willowbrook Security Division," the shorter one replied too quickly, his eyes darting nervously. "Now, sir, we need to see those documents immediately and inspect the vehicle for evidence." There was no such thing as a Willowbrook Security Division. I knew every law enforcement agency within a 100-mile radius, and these clowns weren't cops. They weren't even good at pretending to be cops. But I decided to play along and see exactly how far they'd push their ridiculous charade. "Of course, officers. Let me get my paperwork," I said, closing the door and grabbing my real federal credentials. "I'll be right back." When I stepped outside again, the fake cops were already walking toward my Porsche, and the tall one was pulling out what looked suspiciously like a key. "Excuse me," I called out sharply. "What exactly are you doing?" "Sir, we've received reports that this vehicle matches the exact description of a stolen Porsche reported in the next county over. We're going to need to impound it immediately for a full investigation. And you just happen to have a key that fits my car?" The shorter fake cop fumbled desperately with his words. We have universal access tools for legitimate security purposes during investigations." I almost burst out laughing. These amateurs were about to attempt grand theft auto in broad daylight while dressed as the world's most obvious fake police officers. Officers, before you do anything else, I need to see your badges and identification more clearly. Standard department policy, I'm sure you understand. They exchanged panicked glances. The tall one tried to act intimidating, puffing out his chest. Sir, you're interfering with an active police investigation. Step back immediately or you'll be charged with obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. Obstruction? I smiled, reaching slowly into my back pocket. Gentlemen, before this situation goes any further, I think there's something very important you both need to know. I pulled out my U.S. Marshal's badge and credentials, holding them up so both fake cops could see them clearly in the morning sunlight. My name is Deputy U.S. Marshal Jake Morrison, and you two gentlemen are about to be arrested for impersonating federal officers, conspiracy to commit vehicle theft, fraud, and about 6 other federal crimes I can think of off the top of my head. I strongly suggest you step away from my vehicle immediately and place your hands where I can see them. The transformation was instantaneous and almost comical. The color drained from both men's faces so quickly I thought one of them might faint. The shorter one actually stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet in his panic. This is a huge mistake, the tall one stammered, his fake authority evaporating like steam. We were told. Someone said this was legitimate. Someone told you to dress up like police officers and steal my car? I stepped closer, letting my voice take on the authoritative tone I'd perfected over 2 decades of federal law enforcement. Who exactly told you that? The fake cops looked at each other with the desperate eyes of cornered animals. Finally, the shorter one completely cracked under pressure. Mrs. Thornfield. Margaret Thornfield paid us $500 each to come here and take the car away. She said it was illegally parked and needed to be removed for community safety. She gave us the uniforms and everything. She said you were just some troublemaker who would back down if we acted official. Perfect. Margaret had just escalated her HOA power trip into multiple federal felonies. Here's exactly what's going to happen, I continued, pulling out my phone while keeping my eyes locked on both men. I'm calling real police officers now. You two are going to sit on that curb over there and wait quietly while I explain to them how you attempted to steal a federal officer's vehicle while impersonating law enforcement. If either of you moves before they arrive, I'll treat it as an escape attempt and respond accordingly. Within minutes, the street was filled with the flashing lights of 3 actual patrol cars. The contrast between real law enforcement officers and Margaret's hired amateurs was immediately obvious to everyone watching. Real cops moved with confidence and authority, their uniforms were immaculate, and their badges were genuine. As the 2 would-be car thieves were loaded into the back of squad cars, I explained the situation to Sergeant Williams, a veteran officer I'd worked with on several federal cases. So let me get this straight, Jake, Sergeant Williams said, barely containing his laughter. Your HOA president hired fake cops to steal your Porsche because she doesn't like expensive cars in the neighborhood? That's exactly what happened. And based on what I know about Margaret Thornfield, I have a strong feeling this is just the opening move in her campaign of harassment. I was absolutely right. Over the next week, Margaret escalated her war against me to levels that would have impressed the organized crime bosses I'd spent years pursuing. She sent certified letters claiming my car was a neighborhood nuisance and safety hazard. She organized a petition among residents to have my driveway declared a visual pollution zone. She contacted local news stations with her story about excessive displays of wealth disrupting community harmony and property values. She even hired a private investigator to follow me, apparently hoping to find some violation of law or HOA rules she could use against me. The PI was about as subtle as a freight train, parking across the street in an obvious surveillance van and following me to court appearances like he was tracking a dangerous fugitive. But Margaret had made one critical mistake in all her scheming. She had chosen to target a federal law enforcement officer with 20 years of experience in investigation, surveillance, and building criminal cases. It was time to turn the tables. Using skills I'd developed tracking fugitives across multiple states, I began conducting my own investigation into Margaret's activities. I installed discrete security cameras around my property and started building a comprehensive file on every HOA violation she ignored for her friends while targeting me with harassment. What I discovered was absolutely stunning. Margaret's own property had numerous violations she consistently overlooked for herself. Her fence was 6 inches taller than HOA regulations allowed. Her garden shed exceeded size limitations by nearly 30%. She had an unauthorized satellite dish hidden behind decorative screens. She'd painted her house a color that wasn't on the approved list. Most importantly, she was systematically embezzling HOA funds to pay for her own landscaping improvements. But the real bombshell came when I ran comprehensive background checks on Margaret and her inner circle of HOA enforcers using federal databases. Margaret Thornfield had an extensive criminal record that somehow hadn't been disclosed when she ran for HOA president. 3 arrests for harassment and stalking, 2 restraining orders filed against her by previous neighbors, and a conviction for filing false police reports. Her lieutenant, Carol Brennan, had been fired from her last job for financial fraud and check kiting. Tom Perkins, the HOA treasurer, had a suspended license for tax evasion and had been sued twice for breach of fiduciary duty. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was being operated by a criminal organization masquerading as community volunteers. It was time to take decisive action. My first move was methodical and professional. I filed formal complaints with the county recorder's office, documenting every instance of selective enforcement and financial irregularity I'd uncovered. I also contacted the district attorney's office, providing comprehensive evidence of Margaret's embezzlement and the fake police incident, along with her criminal history. Then I got creative. Margaret had scheduled an emergency HOA meeting to discuss the Porsche problem and vote on new restrictions that would specifically target my vehicle and force me to remove it from the community. She sent official notices to every homeowner, claiming I was destroying property values and creating an unsafe environment for children and families. What Margaret didn't know was that I'd been quietly talking to my neighbors over the past 2 weeks, sharing the evidence I'd gathered about the HOA leadership's criminal activities and financial mismanagement. People who had lived in fear of Margaret's retaliation for years were finally learning the truth about their so-called community leaders. The night of the meeting, Margaret stood at the front of the community center, confident in her power and certain of her victory. About 70 homeowners had shown up, the largest crowd in the HOA's history. Margaret assumed they were all there to support her campaign against me. She was about to learn how wrong she was. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Margaret began, her voice filled with false sweetness and barely concealed triumph. "We're here to address a serious problem that threatens our community's values, safety, and property investments. Mr. Morrison's inappropriate vehicle display." "Margaret," interrupted Bill Hendricks, a retired teacher who lived 3 houses down from me and had been one of her most frequent targets. "Before we talk about Jake's car, shouldn't we discuss the missing landscaping funds?" Margaret's face went pale and I could see her hands starting to shake. "I'm sorry, what?" "The $12,000 in HOA funds that were supposed to go toward community improvements but somehow ended up paying for new flower beds and irrigation systems in your front yard?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Margaret tried desperately to regain control of the situation. There's been a misunderstanding about those expenses. They were properly authorized through normal channels." "Authorized by who?" asked Sandra Mitchell, waving a thick folder of financial documents. "Because according to these HOA financial records that Jake helped us obtain through the county, you've been signing unauthorized checks for months without board approval." The meeting erupted into chaos. Neighbor after neighbor stood up, sharing stories of Margaret's harassment, selective enforcement, and bullying tactics that had gone unchallenged for years. People who had been intimidated into silence finally found their voices and their courage. Margaret tried frantically to redirect attention back to my Porsche, but it was too late. The carefully constructed facade had crumbled, and her reign of suburban tyranny was crashing down around her. "This meeting is officially adjourned," she shouted, gathering her papers with shaking hands. "Actually," I said, standing up for the first time that evening, "I don't think it is." The room fell completely silent as I walked to the front, my federal badge visible on my belt. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Deputy U.S. Marshal Jake Morrison. Over the past 3 weeks, I've been conducting a thorough investigation into serious crimes committed by your HOA leadership, including embezzlement of community funds, harassment, filing false police reports, and conspiracy to commit theft by hiring individuals to impersonate law enforcement officers." I turned to face Margaret directly. "Mrs. Thornfield, you are under citizen's arrest for conspiracy to commit grand theft auto, embezzlement of community funds, filing false police reports, and harassment. The district attorney's office has already been provided with all evidence and will be filing formal federal charges against you tomorrow morning." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For the first time since I'd met her, the woman who terrorized an entire neighborhood was completely speechless. "Are under citizen's arrest for conspiracy to commit theft, embezzlement of community funds, and filing false police reports. The district attorney's office will be contacting you tomorrow with formal charges." Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. For the first time since I'd met her, she was completely speechless. The crowd erupted in applause. Neighbors who had lived in fear of HOA retribution for years were finally free to express their frustration with Margaret's tyrannical rule. But the story doesn't end there. Over the next few weeks, the real scope of Margaret's crimes became clear. She had been systematically bullying homeowners into paying for unnecessary improvements, while pocketing the money. She had filed dozens of false complaints with city officials about neighbors who dared to oppose her. She had even tried to manipulate property tax assessments to drive out residents she didn't like. The fake police incident led to federal charges. Hiring individuals to impersonate law enforcement officers and attempt to steal property belonging to a federal officer turned what might have been a local misdemeanor into a serious federal crime. Margaret ultimately pled guilty to embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy charges. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA. Carol Brennan and Tom Perkins received shorter sentences and probation for their roles in the scheme. The HOA was dissolved and reformed with new leadership elected by genuine community vote. The first act of the new board was to eliminate all arbitrary vehicle restrictions and focus on actual community improvements rather than petty power plays. As for my Porsche, it still sits in my driveway every morning, gleaming in the sunlight. Sometimes I catch new neighbors admiring it, and I always invite them over to take a closer look. It's amazing how much friendlier people become when they're not living under the thumb of a neighborhood dictator. The incident taught me valuable lessons about how power corrupts, even at the most local level. Margaret wasn't evil, she was a small person who had been given just enough authority to become dangerous. When unchecked power meets personal insecurity, the results can destroy entire communities. But it also showed me the resilience of good people when they finally find the courage to stand up to bullies. My neighbors weren't cowards, they were normal folks who had been systematically intimidated by someone who weaponized bureaucracy for personal revenge. 6 months later, I received a letter from the new HOA president, thanking me for helping restore peace to Willowbrook Estates. Property values had actually increased since Margaret's removal, as word spread that the neighborhood was no longer under the control of a tyrannical HOA regime. The letter included a small addendum that made me smile. P.S. Your Porsche looks fantastic in the driveway. Thank you for bringing a touch of class to our community. Sometimes justice comes from federal courts and lengthy investigations. Sometimes it comes from fake cops trying to steal the wrong person's car. And sometimes it comes from neighbors finally having enough courage to say, no more, to the bullies who make their lives miserable. Margaret learned the hard way that when you mess with someone's property, you'd better make sure they're not a federal law enforcement officer with 2 decades of experience taking down criminals far more dangerous than a power-hungry HOA president. My Porsche and I are very happy in our new neighborhood. And Margaret? Well, she's learning about community living in a very different kind of institution, where the rules are enforced by people who don't care at all about property values or vehicle restrictions. The moral of the story is simple: bullies count on their victims staying quiet and isolated. The moment good people stand together and refuse to be intimidated, the bully's power evaporates like morning mist. And sometimes, karma arrives in the form of a U.S. Marshal who just wanted to park his car in peace.